Good morning, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm one of the people who's here 10 years on from 2016. It's a delight to be here, and thank you to Henri for inviting me, Serge, and Pierre for organization work, and other organizers as well. It was nice to see that Henri was using the same slide template from 10 years ago. Green slides, I remember them very well. It's nice that some things don't change. Many things change. Different venue, different year, but yeah, some consistency there. I'm going to be talking about dual processes and metacognition and reasoning, picking up on some of the themes that Henri's just mentioned. In terms of dual processes, there's a long-standing notion in the reasoning literature that there's a distinction between what you might say is fast intuitive thinking or processing and slower, more reflective processing. It's a distinction that was really driven in the 60s and 70s by classic work by Peter Wason, University College London. This notion of a qualitative distinction between two different kinds of thinking processes. And then that theme was picked up by Jonathan Evans, Peter Wason's PhD student at the time, who then moved on to Plymouth University and set up an extensive lab there looking at dual processes and reasoning. So from modest beginnings, really, this whole notion of dual process and reasoning has burgeoned, and there's been many hundreds of studies that have looked at the nature of dual processes in thinking, reasoning, problem solving, cognition more generally. The notion was really popularized by Daniel Kahneman in 2011 in his book Thinking Fast and Slow. But became quite a popular book. You find it at airports. A lot of people have read it, and it's really from that point, even more work has been done on dual processes in reasoning. So I'll pick up on some of the developmental aspects, some of the way in which notions of dual processes have changed over the years in the reasoning literature. I'll get quite up to date. And also I'll touch upon this really important notion of metacognition in reasoning and how metacognition links to dual process theory. So metacognition is all about the regulatory processes that allow us to monitor and to control our ongoing thinking and reasoning. And what I will argue is that metacognition, when overlaid with notions of dual processing, is really quite, has allowed for quite a rich understanding of fast and slow thinking, intuitive and reflective thinking. The two frameworks, if you like, combine quite neatly to drive forward some really interesting theorizing. So in terms of the aims of my talk this morning, I first of all want to overview some key concepts in the literature that are associated with the nature of dual processes in reasoning. And I'll particularly focus upon what I think is a really important framework for thinking about dual processes presented by Evans and Stanovich in an article in Perspectives on Psychological Science in 2013. It's an article that really allowed Evans and Stanovich to kind of articulate the state of the art around dual process theorizing at that time, to also reflect on some criticisms that had been lodged against dual process theorizing, and to address those criticisms. So the article was a target article. It had a number of quite extensive commentaries, 5 or 6 commentaries, and then Evans and Stanovich replied to those commentaries to further advance theorizing in the area. For me, this is a really important set of papers and probably a set of papers that really captures dual processing theorizing extremely well, even to this time. I'll then look at some of the key criticisms relating to the dual process framework, particularly around its falsifiability, its testability, that were really articulated in that 2013 set of papers. I'll then examine the way in which metacognitive monitoring and control processes seem to be integral to thinking about dual processes in reasoning and the way in which they've advanced an understanding of dual process theorizing. I'll then move on to look specifically at one particular phenomenon in the reasoning literature, which is that of belief bias, the way in which our reasoning seems to be driven by our beliefs, by our real-world knowledge and beliefs. I'll show how the study of belief bias has really led to some very testable predictions that have facilitated theoretical advancement around dual process theorizing. And then I'll move on towards the end of the talk to look at some current research directions in dual process theorizing. So that's the shape and form of the talk. When I'm talking about reasoning, I'm really referring to sort of classic problems that have been studied in the reasoning literature. Things like categorical syllogisms that use the quantifiers all, no, some are not. So you've got an abstract categorical syllogism up there, all A are B, some B are C. Therefore, some A are C. People are given premises and conclusions are like that one, and are asked whether the conclusion follows logically from the premises or not. So these are kind of endorsement problems where people are asked to say whether a conclusion follows or not. There's a belief-based syllogism there. Again, a categorical syllogism. All animals have brains, dogs are mammals. All mammals have brains, dogs are mammals, therefore dogs have brains. Does that conclusion follow or not from the given premises? People have also studied conditional syllogisms, which we'll hear about later today, I'm sure, and disjunctive syllogisms as presented there. Belief bias as a notion is actually something that's very particular to the categorical syllogisms, although believable conclusions can feature in any of those kind of problems, whether conditional, whether you're looking at conditional syllogisms or disjunctive syllogisms. It's just a historical artifact that when we talk about belief bias, we're usually talking about it in the context of people reasoning with categorical syllogisms. If we look at the dual process framework as espoused by Evans and Stanovich in 2013. For me, it's a really interesting framework. As I said, it sort of captures the state of the art at that time. The notion is quite simple. There's two types of processes that drive higher cognition. Type 1 processes, which are fundamentally intuitive in nature, and type 2 processes, which are fundamentally reflective or analytic in nature. And what Evans and Stanovich argue in this paper, and it's a very important argument, is that there are defining features of type 1 and type 2 processing. They're what I've placed in red there. So the defining features of intuitive type 1 processing are that it does not require working memory, and that it's autonomous in nature, that it, when it's triggered, it sort of continues to completion. So minimal involvement of working memory and autonomy. Whereas type 2 processes require working memory, orthogonal in terms of type 1 process, and are involved in what you might call cognitive decoupling, sort of decontextualized, more abstract reasoning, mental simulation, sort of what-if kind of reasoning, and generally kind of hypothetical thinking. So those are the defining features. What are in blue are what you might call correlated features. So you can see type 1 processing is often fast, high capacity, parallel in nature, non-conscious, leads to biased responding. It's contextualized, heavily contextualized, automatic and associative in nature, very much experience-based thinking and decision-making, and generally independent of cognitive ability. But they are correlated features. They're not necessary and sufficient features. The defining features are what are important and what really distinguish type 1 processing and differentiate it from type 2 processing. Type 2 processing also has correlated features, orthogonal to the type 1 ones. So slow, capacity limited, serial in nature, conscious, typically leading to normative responses, maybe logical responses if logic is your norm. Abstract in nature, controlled, rule-based, leading to consequential decision-making and dependent on cognitive ability. Type 2 processes, importantly, are not invulnerable to biases. So again, thinking about these features as being correlated, the ones in blue as correlated, you could engage in type 2 processing, but you might tend to be more normative in your decision-making or your reasoning. But type 2 processing is not invulnerable to biases. This could be because of what's called defective mind awareness, an evocative term generated by Keith Stanovich. This notion that we have, computational process, algorithmic process, rule-based process, but they may in some way be defective and lead to biased type 2 responding. Or we may have limited working memory capacity, and therefore we have the requisite mindware, the requisite rules of inference, but we can't apply them effectively because of limited processing capacity. So that's a very important distinction, very important notion. That people often think about type 2 processing, reflective processing as being, not biased, but it can be biased. Likewise, type 1 processing, intuitive processing, need not be biased. Often quick, intuitive, heuristic kind of type 1 reasoning can lead to effective responses, can lead to good responses. Although there's a tendency towards responses being biased when they're intuitive, they need not be. The dual process framework espoused by Evans and Stanovich was also linked to notions at the time around two different systems of reasoning, or two different types of mind, an old mind and a new mind, really playing into Kahneman's notions here around two systems of reasoning. Historically, there's work by Steve Sloman that argued for two different systems of reasoning in 1996. The old mind, system one, evolved early, similar to animal cognition, based around highly implicit knowledge and basic emotions, very much tied to the limbic system, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, those kind of deep brain areas. Whereas a new mind, much more linked to sort of prefrontal cortex, temporal cortex, evolved late, distinctively human nature, involving explicit knowledge and complex emotions. I think nowadays that sort of two-system view, that two-system kind of overlay of type 1 versus type 2 processing is seen as highly simplistic, too simplistic, really, to sort of characterize the complexity of what's going on. But it's an interesting notion that still pervades to some extent. What about criticisms of the dual process framework? Remember that the Evans and Stanovich article in 2013 was really not just about encapsulating the state of the art at the time, but also about dealing with criticisms against dual process theorizing. One sort of criticism, particularly espoused by Krugolansky, Gigerenza 2011, is that the dual process framework is falsified when you see non-alignment between these sort of clusters of features, type 1, or the cluster of features for type 2 processing. For example, if you see fast yet highly normative responding. But this criticism is clearly unfair for the reasons I've explained. It's focused upon a highly simplified version of the dual process framework, where all the correlates of type 1 processing are assumed to be necessary features of type 1 processing, and all the features of type 2 processing are seen to be necessary features for type 2 processing. That notion is dispelled in the dual process framework of Evans and Stanovich 2013. Critics then kind of replied by saying, well, isn't the whole dual process framework therefore kind of unfalsifiable? But again, this seems to be an inappropriate criticism, because there are defining features for type 1 processing and type 2 processing that are open to scientific testing. Notions of working memory involvement, for example, are critical to the distinction between type 1 and type 2. And also, if the dual process framework is just a framework, from it you can derive highly specific models of dual process functioning for specific tasks, like categorical syllogisms or disjunctive syllogisms. And when you explicate the nature of those kind of process models in great detail, then of course you've got testable assumptions about the way in which type 1 and type 2 processes interplay in order to determine responding. So what Evans and Stanovich argue is that really this kind of criticism about falsifiability is being lodged at a sort of a meta-theoretical level. It's at the framework level, which is not an appropriate level for applying a falsification criterion. What you should really do is, look for falsifiable data at the specific process model of task-specific dual process models. Yeah.
If you can just elaborate on the concept of unfalsifiable.
Yes, I mean, it's the Popperian notion that science should be driven by searching for not confirmatory evidence that proves or validates a particular hypothesis or a particular claim or a particular theoretical position, but what's really important is to look for evidence that disconfirms the theory, and the basis of science should be around falsification in order to drive forward knowledge. And it's only if all theories are potentially falsifiable, and it's really important for science to drive forward that sort of search for falsification. So, I mean, it's seen as a sort of an important claim in the literature. If theorists can sort of say, well, your theory is unfalsifiable, then you haven't got a decent theory. All the theories should be open to falsification. Mark?
Just another clarification. Could you say more about the normative category? Because to me, that seems to be fundamentally, you know, on the other side rather than on the deliberative side.
The normative feature, the normative, yeah, I mean, it's very much more on the type 2 side in terms of reasoning being, yeah, more aligned with normative responding. But I mean, as I said, whilst type 1 processing is seen to be more intuitive, more biased, less normative, you can produce, you know, rapid intuitive responses that are completely logical in nature. I mean, people are very good with certain logical rules, like, you know, modus ponens, if A then B, there's an A. People readily conclude that there's a B, you know, so rapid intuitive responding can indeed be normative. I've just got my slides a bit messed up here. Okay. Yes, thank you. We're back. Let's look a little bit more at the dual process framework and assumptions associated with that framework. It's referred to by Evans and Stanovich as being a default interventionist framework. This idea that intuitive processes produce a default reasoning response that can then be reflected upon to produce a type 2 response. Type 1 default responses are typically viewed as being based upon heuristics, rules of thumb, prior experience, pattern recognition, you know, all of these things that allow for sort of rapid intuitive responding. Type 2 processing can then intervene on the response that has arisen from intuitive processing, but it is not viewed as being automatically engaged unless it's triggered in some way. And this could be because of motivation. For example, the motivation to check your intuitive response. I mean, I'm a compulsive checker. I check everything. So I'm one of these people who's highly motivated to check intuitive judgments. Other people might be less motivated to check intuitive responses. They might not have a disposition to engage in that kind of analytic, reflective thinking. And then if type 2 processing is engaged, it can modify potentially the default response, or it can potentially even override completely the default response, or it can perhaps justify the default response. All possibilities are there. The dotted vertical line just reflects the fact that this type 2 reflective thinking is not obligatory. It's not always engaged. It's not always triggered, but it can be subject to things like motivational factors. And here we get onto the notion of meta-reasoning and metacognition, which I think was a real impetus towards new dual process theorizing when it arrived. This is Raghava Ackerman and Valerie Thompson's model from 2017, 2018. They presented a dual process framework of meta-reasoning that looks at the sort of metacognitive monitoring and metacognitive control processes that underpin reasoning. So we've got reasoning on the far left-hand column, and then metacognitive monitoring, metacognitive control on the right-hand side. Really important model. And as you can see, the way in which reasoning is thought about in this model is very much as a default interventionist sort of dual process kind of process, where people identify components and goals and then come towards generating an initial autonomous response, which could then be subjected to analytic processing. To be fair to Ackerman and Thompson, they say, although they've conceptualized this model as, you know, in a dual process kind of way, this is not essential. You could think about a single process model of reasoning and overlay the sort of meta-reasoning framework over a single process. But interesting that they presented it as a sort of dual process approach. Monitoring, you can see, is heavily involved in processes such as judging whether you've got the knowledge and strategy to even tackle a problem in the first place, maybe some initial judgments of whether you can solve the problem or not. This really important notion of feeling of rightness. which links to the initial intuitive response that's been driven, whether you feel the initial response is right or not. If you feel that it's not right, then that might trigger more processing, more analytic processing, which can lead to final output and a final judgment of confidence. So those are the monitoring processes, but you've got all the control processes that are needed to actually, get you up and solving the problem in the first place, to engage in solving, or to decide whether to give up, or control process to sort of reconsider initial response if you're uneasy about it, if you've got a low feeling of rightness, maybe to try another strategy, maybe to give up and say, I just don't know, or to seek help. So it's really interesting concepts within the meta-reasoning framework. Very important is this idea that metacognitive monitoring is highly sensitive to the sort of ongoing dynamic fluency of processing. If processing feels fluent, then you'll keep doing it, you'll keep going. But if you reach a point where you feel that processing is disfluent, you may well stop and try a different strategy. The metacognitive control is highly responsive to ongoing feelings of fluency. The fluency which comes with a default response is viewed as sort of coming to mind with a feeling of rightness. It is a feeling. So there's this notion that it's a highly effective response that you have to an initial intuitive judgment, initial intuitive response. And then that feeling of rightness, if it's low, can act as a metacognitive trigger that can switch processing towards type 2 processing, switch it to the analytic processing component on the left-hand side. So really interesting notions here. They're very important for dual process theory, and really, I think, we're a catalyst for new theoretical development for dual process theorizing. Let me switch now to looking at the belief bias paradigm and some data around dual processes in reasoning that have come from the study of belief bias. Belief bias is a phenomenon that arises when people's reasoning responses are driven by the believability of conclusions rather than their logical validity. So according to logic, a conclusion is only valid if it's necessarily true given the premises. It's no good that a conclusion might be consistent with the premises. It has to be necessarily true for it to be logically valid. So there's two example syllogisms there. You can see the first one has a believable conclusion, but it is in fact an invalid conclusion. All flowers need water, all roses need water, therefore all roses are flowers. Okay, it's believable, but it is in fact invalid. The second problem there has an unbelievable conclusion, but it is in fact valid. All vehicles have wheels, all boats have vehicles, therefore all boats have wheels. Clearly an unbelievable conclusion, but in this case it's valid. When you permute believability and validity, you can get the four example kinds of problems that are shown in that matrix. You can get valid believable and valid unbelievable problems, and you get invalid believable and invalid unbelievable problems. So I've highlighted the ones in blue where belief and validity concur. And I've highlighted the ones which I've just shown you in red, where belief and validity are in conflict. They're often referred to as conflict problems in the literature, the red ones, the blue ones as no conflict or non-conflict problems. These examples are taken from Denez and France in 2009. So the standard belief bias paradigm, you give people loads of problems like these and see how they respond. Look at their endorsement rates, where people are asked to decide whether a conclusion follows or not. That's the standard paradigm. The classic findings, quite historical now, from 1983, come from work by Evans and colleagues, where they really had a paradigm that had very tight controls over logic and believability, lots of pre-testing of believability, really standardized problems. And the findings are absolutely fascinating and have really driven the last, decades of research on the phenomenon. So what you find is a main effect of belief. Believable conclusions are endorsed more than unbelievable ones. So you can see you're 80% for believables, the mean 80%. endorse much more than unbelievable conclusions, 33%. So that's your main effect of belief. You also have a main effect of logic. So people are somewhat logical in their responding. You can see that there's an overall 72% endorsement of valid conclusions versus a 40% endorsement of invalid conclusions. People have some logic ability, whilst also being to some extent biased by beliefs. And then you also find this classic interaction between logic and belief. One way of thinking about that interaction is in terms of belief bias, this difference between believable and unbelievable endorsement rates being greater on invalid problems, 71% versus 10%, than on valid problems, 89 versus 57. Smaller gap there, big gap when you have 71 versus 10. So belief bias is greater on invalid than valid syllogisms. An alternative way of thinking about an interaction, and really the way that has driven a lot of research, is to think about the effects of validity as being greater on unbelievable conclusions than on believable conclusions. So you're looking at things vertically here. You're looking at the 57% versus the 10%. So validity, logic shows a bigger separation on unbelievable conclusions than on believable ones, 89 versus 71%. And just look again at the conflict problems versus the no conflict problems. The no conflict items in blue, generally you're seeing effective responding there in terms of normative standards. Valid, believable, 89%. People are generally endorsing those conclusions just as they should. And then invalid, unbelievable ones, the 10%, people are generally not endorsing those. They're rejecting those conclusions just as they should. And then, for the conflict items, this is where you're getting ineffective responding. People are accepting many more believable invalid conclusions at 71% than they should do. And people are, when it comes to valid, unbelievable, they should be accepting these ones because they're valid, but they're just above chance level there. Let's look at what is really now a sort of a classic model of dual process model, default interventions model to explain that pattern of data, those findings, the main effect of belief, the main effect of logic, and the logic by belief interaction. It's referred to as the selective processing model. Comes from Evans and colleagues in 2001. They argue that the default heuristic response, the type 1 response, is just to accept believable and to reject unbelievable conclusions. There's always a bit of this going on, and that explains why you have the belief bias effect, and it's seen to some extent with both valid and invalid items, just a sort of basic response bias to accept believable and reject unbelievable conclusions. They argue that analytic intervention, reflective intervention, type 2 intervention, if it happens, is itself then biased by conclusion believability. What they propose is that people attempt to search for just a single representation of the premises, a single mental model, if you like, that confirms the believable conclusions, but that refutes unbelievable conclusions. So the way in which you search for a representation of the premises is driven by conclusion believability. You look to confirm believable conclusions, you look to refute unbelievable conclusions. Now, importantly, valid conclusions, whether they're believable or unbelievable, because they're valid, they can only be confirmed. You can only find confirmatory representations when you look for a representation of the premises. Whereas invalid conclusions are what you would refer to as indeterminate. There can be both models that confirm the conclusion and models or representations that refute the conclusion. So if you have an invalid conclusion which is indeterminate, you can find a believable representation, a representation of the premises that goes along with belief if you look for it, and you can find a representation that refutes the conclusion if it's unbelievable if you look for it. And that explains the interaction effect that you see between logic and belief. Okay, it's quite a subtle argument, but it's really quite powerful. A really interesting sort of theoretical idea. The thing with that model is that it really says that people are only searching for confirmatory or disconfirmatory representations. They're only constructing single representations. And therefore the question is, well, shouldn't people's response times be pretty uniform across all different types of syllogistic items? If all they're doing is searching for a confirmatory representation or a disconfirmatory representation, they're creating a single representation. Shouldn't that just lead to uniform response times or processing latencies? That question was addressed in some work that I did with colleagues in 2006, where we actually did an eye tracking study, where we got detailed inspection time data for people looking at the premises of syllogisms and the conclusions of syllogisms and measure of overall processing time. And what we found was far from uniform processing times across all problems. What you can see very clearly is that there's something interesting happening in the invalid believable case. Problems out of a believable conclusion, but are in fact invalid. You're getting these long overall processing times here derived from eye tracking measures. And that overall time, that 20.1 is clearly standout difference to the overall processing times for the other problems. That shouldn't be happening according to the selective processing model. You can see the effect on the conclusions for those problems, 6.1, people are spending longer looking at the conclusions for those problems. They're also spending long in this sort of post-conclusion looking time on premises. So after they've read the premises and looked at the conclusion, you're getting this long sort of re-looking time at the premises again, this 9.7. So something peculiar is going on here on one of these conflict items, the invalid believable conflict item. Perhaps to some extent there's something going on the valid unbelievable side as well. Some evidence of perhaps longer processing going on with that other conflict problem. So that's a little bit tricky for the selective processing model to explain, but with revisions, I think the model can start to provide some explanation. What one has to realize, and I mean, this is adapted from Evans 2011, is that there's individual differences in people's reasoning. Some people might be highly intuitive, just rapid responders, not doing any type 2 processing. Other people might be very analytically engaged and have cognitive resources to engage in sort of effective rule-based reasoning. So I think when you think about the default interventionist model and the selective processing model with the reflective mind added in, as Stanovich calls it, and the algorithmic mind added in, you can start to see how overall patterns of data might actually break down into different sort of subgroups of data that may account for these variable inspection time findings that I've just shown you. So motivational factors would be things like instructional sets and thinking dispositions and the way in which you respond to sort of feeling of rightness and potentially engage in more sort of type 2 analytic processing. The algorithmic mind is sort of your working memory capacity, your cognitive resources, your mindware, as Stanovich calls it, and the like. And really, these are all sort of tapping into how you sort of set a degree of critical effort to engage in the task, whether you trigger type 2 processing, whether you're motivated to, whether you've got the cognitive resources to. So this is all the sort of metacognitive stuff creeping into the model here, 2011, which is very important. Just to summarize there, perhaps the long latencies in aggregate data for the conflict items, particularly that one particular conflict item, reflect a subset of reasoners that engage in sort of this time-consuming type 2 reflective processing. This was the argument that Stuplin et al. Started to develop in 2011. And they indeed provided support for this proposal that there's basically individual variation in people's reasoning that can account for some of these inspection time finding differences that you get from the study that I showed you. What they identified is really 3 different subsets of reasoning ability. So this is, thinking about the selective processing model, but from an individual differences perspective, where you actually separate people into 3 different reasoning groups dependent upon their logical reasoning ability: a high logic group on the right, a medium logic group on the left, and a low logic group. on the far left, with mean response times being shown on the vertical axis. What's very interesting, I think, is if you look at the high logic group on the far right, you get these enormously long processing times. These are response latencies for the invalid believable problems. It seems to be this high logic group that are doing something really involved and engaged with these valid believable problems, which is kind of coming out in the aggregate data, perhaps even swamping the aggregate data. But it's explicable in terms of what these high logic people are doing. These high logic people are basically getting all the problems right, but they're driven to engage in extensive analytic processing of these invalid believable problems. The medium logic group are really performing much like the selective processing model would predict. The response patterns, if you look at them, the endorsement rates are very much as predicted by the selective processing model. A bit of a hint of some more kind of processing going on with the invalid believables again, but no real statistical separation across the data there. And then the low logic group are just really performing intuitively. They're just accepting believable conclusions, rejecting unbelievable ones. So when you break down the profile of reasoners in terms of their logical ability, you get these interesting differences in latency profiles that seem to be explicable in terms of a sort of an extended default interventionist model. Just to summarize where we've got to then, the original selective processing model is effective at explaining endorsement rates, but seems to struggle with response time results, latency results, eye movement tracking results, and the like. The recognition of individual variation in motivation, the reflective mind and cognitive ability, the algorithmic mind, and the important role of metacognitive control in triggering type 2 respondents seem to enable a default interventionist model, such as a selective processing model, to explain individual differences in response times. One curious finding, however, is that low ability reasoners seem still to be aware, they still seem to have some sense of the conflict between logic and belief for those conflict problems, despite the fact that they're responding rapidly and intuitively to those problems. Let me just go back to, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Oops. It happened again. Yeah, thank you. I'll get that one up.
No.
I'm just going to go back to the graph showing different reasoning profiles. And what you will see with the low logic group, this group that are responding really rapidly and intuitively to the problems, is that they still seem to be showing some sensitivity to the conflict between logic and belief as manifest in longer, slightly longer decision latencies. I get them. I'll scroll down. If I click there, yeah, I'm doing it.
C'est comme si Alexandre est figé.
I'm on the right slide, but it's not.
You're on the right slide here.
Yeah.
Can just stop there.
Sorry about this.
Ouais, c'est gelé.
Slide deck seems to have frozen. If I try and move it. Yeah, it's really frozen.
I'll stop. I've moved it.
Mhm. Thank you. Fantastic. Sorry about that. So what you see in the low logic group is that those conflict items are producing these slightly longer mean response times. If you collapse the data for conflict versus no conflict items in the low logic group, you find a significant difference there. Something's going on. I mean, these people are responding really quickly, but they still seem to have this sensitivity to the conflict between logic and belief. How can that possibly be? Well, this is where we move on to really interesting new wave dual process models of belief bias, or what Wim Deneys refers to as dual process theory 2.0. And really what you find is, if you look at response times, but also a whole range of converging evidence, is that people do seem to have this sensitivity to the logical status of conclusions, even when they're responding intuitively and non-normatively. This is this notion that Wim has coined, which I think is really quite nice, which is that people are biased, they're responding intuitively and incorrectly, but they're also in doubt. You know, they're responding rapidly, they're biased, but they're in doubt, and it's reflected in longer response times. It's also reflected, this sort of doubt is also reflected in confidence ratings. People are less confident with these conflict problems. In terms of autonomous arousal data from galvanic skin response, skin conductance, from recent pupil dilation data from Purcell et al. 2023, brain activation patterns, just about whatever methodology you apply to look at people's intuitive responding, you seem to find evidence of this sort of normative heuristic conflict. There's something going on. What is the best way then to conceive of this normative knowledge that people seem to have that allows them rapidly to detect logic belief conflicts during intuitive processing? Fabulous, thank you. Deneys has argued that normative sensitivity is really entirely intuitive, implicit in nature, based around implicit experiences, automatically activated, and can be referred to as being some kind of logical intuition. It's a fascinating notion. Present briefly the logical intuition model that Deneys has sort of coined. The idea here is that the intuitive system has two parallel processing streams. It can drive in parallel a belief-based sort of heuristic type 1 intuitive response, as well as an intuitive logic-based response. And then that conflict between intuitive heuristic and intuitive logic can be detected by the metacognitive system prior to perhaps driving deliberate processing, as Wim calls it, reflective processing of type 2. Type 2 processing in this model is again kind of optional. Its recruitment and its efficacy are likely to depend on motivational, dispositional, and cognitive capacity factors, as we've sort of been talking about. This model can really seem to explain many, many findings that derive from the wealth of sort of data I've alluded to. Just some potential caveats with the logical intuitions model. I mean, it's a very exciting model. A lot of research has been going on around this over the last decade. First of all, very positively, the evidence for the model is really genuinely multi-method in nature, highly convergent data, and many biased reasoners are seen to have this sensitivity to logic belief conflicts arising at this sort of intuitive level. There's some evidence that conflict detection may be stronger for some logical forms, particularly easier logical forms. Although there's very recent evidence suggesting contrary evidence that people are just as good at spotting logic belief conflicts with complex logical forms as they are with easier logical forms. In that case, in the Yang et al. Study with belief-oriented syllogisms. There's some evidence that people's sensitivity may be in some way partial or somewhat graded, somewhat task-dependent, opposed to there being a sort of a universal conflict detection mechanism that applies across all tasks and all individuals. Lots of work needed to do to look at these issues. There's also evidence that some of these apparent logical intuition effects really be produced by quite superficial structural cues that are there in the problems that happen to correlate with logic. You know, we know that people are attuned to some quite superficial cues in problems, such as the nature of the quantifiers used and whether quantifiers used in the premises appear in the conclusion, what's called atmosphere, and those kind of superficial structural effects that correlate with logic might be driving the logic belief conflict effect. Just to finish off with some concluding thoughts, then I think dual process theorizing is really alive and kicking. It's continuing all the time to advance new theorizing around a range of phenomena. I've talked about belief bias, and we're seeing new and interesting ideas around belief bias coming from dual process theorizing still. I think the addition of metacognitive concepts coming from the meta reasoning model to the addition of those concepts to the dual process sort of theory, the dual process framework, have really helped to clarify what's going on in terms of conflict monitoring, conflict detection, and the role of feeling of rightness in immediate solutions as a sort of way to trigger type 2 processing. So we need those metacognitive notions in these models. And I think the concept of logical intuition is important, and it's spearheaded some really important new developments in dual process research. It seems to be a genuine phenomena, albeit one perhaps with boundary conditions that still need further investigation. Sometimes it seems like those boundary conditions sort of narrow the notion of logical intuition to a subset of tasks or subset of sort of complexity of problems. Other research seems to expand the boundary conditions, and I think we still need to sort of work out where those boundary conditions lie. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Q&A? Oh. David.
Yeah. There's so many interesting points there. Just this one you mentioned towards the end, the Yang et al. Paper, that there could be conflict detection for complex logic.
Yeah.
What examples did they use? Complex logical.
So they present studies that use the most complex syllogisms. I mean, what Johnson Ed would call
specifically
three categorical syllogisms with belief or in contents, and the hardest ones, what Phil Johnson Ed would call 3 model syllogisms that have multiple possible premise representations. Yeah. So I mean, challenging ones, the kind that are typically used in the belief bias literature. Yeah.
Is it Charles at the end? Is it Charles at the end?
I don't know the first name. Yeah.
University of Pennsylvania.
Not sure.
Harvard.
Yeah.
Yes, I think Johnson Laird is the only psychologist of reasoning who's tried to say what a complex logical form is.
True.
Yeah. And then restricted to syllogisms. Since all I don't know what he says these days, but vision of his theory. But of course, like you said, the thing is, it's difficult to define what is a complex logic. But it is interesting that if people have logical about those complex, there is something. There is what Johnson Laird is talking about corresponds to a logical possibility. Because after all, it's only dealing with logical possibilities. Yeah. And so when you talk about legitimately corresponds to a real logical difference. It will take more computational power.
Yeah.
To recognize.
Yeah.
I think that's very interesting.
More search, maybe.
No, very.
I mean, I think Henry and Janine have done work with conditional syllogisms, looking at the logical intuitions effect, and I think you find it dominates in the simpler conditional kind of problems. Modus ponens, modus tollens, but it's modus ponens, modus tollens, but then less evidence with affirmation, the fallacies, affirmation and consequent Can't see.
We're still
Working on it.
just manipulated with the negation, like municipality and non-stolens history.
Right, so you're saying one of the elements of the intuitive be more complex than one of its purpose.
That was our claim, that our first manipulation of complexity, and that was done with women. Study,
Right.
was to like the adding of negation and backward inference versus forward inference.
Yeah.
So our claim was that we expected municipal to be more complex than municipality, but we found evidence of conflict detection for what we
I'm thinking here as a concentration of the market.
Sorry.
Fast and poser des questions. Please speak louder if you.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I think what's really important is there's clearly lots of work to be done here to again is to explore these boundary conditions. I mean, does conflict detection arise, you know, with all problems of all complexities, or is it limited to simpler problems, however you define simplicity? I mean, you know, great work to be done.
Could I add something?
Yeah.
The discussion, maybe it would be I think one route that would be interesting to look at, and maybe at the paper of Yang and Al, is maybe the difference between the formal complexity and the content that was used, possibility of counterexample retrieval. So there might be some parsing to do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's our current thought.
But better controls, yeah,
Mm.
to control for alternative
Yeah.
counterexamples. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, so I would like to back the notion that was brought at the beginning of this seminar, in which it was proposed that there is a different epistemological universes in which different people have different way of contacting each other. And in the lowest model was maintaining that there could be a lack of capacity thinking, but is there not also the possibility that there is different underlying basics of logic in such that it could different at this point, per se, two different logical understanding of such complex or simple forms that may be present in the sets group, but that may be impossible because there is no presumption of such different epistemological universes.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So, I mean, I think what you're arguing is your type 2 reflective processing could be based upon different rule systems, different logics, maybe cultural differences in reasoning style or reasoning strategy could have an impact there. I agree with you completely. I mean, epistemologically, there could be different ways of engaging in type 2 processing, which would lead to different outcomes. I mean, these are all questions that I think need to be explored. You potentially using a dual process framework, but it's a great point. Yeah. Mark.
No, I have to admit, I was one of those people that never really accepted dual process theory when it was first proposed. I guess if we started to make Nobel prizes for it, I had to admit it wrong. But one of the things I like the metacognitive sort of shift in it, and I've done some work myself on metacognition and thinking. But it makes me, what I seem to see here is a set of sort of very empirically driven metrics for looking at certain phenomena. And if I try and think about it computationally, I sort of say to myself, so what's the top level loop here? You know, what is the top level mechanism that's driving the metacognitive steps? And I don't know if anyone's proposed what that might be.
So you're asking for a kind of a process model of type 1.
Well, sometimes it goes into type of rule-based logic, type of decision being made. Other times it looks like it might be just sort of, in a sense, like monitoring a sensor, you know, which would be your evaluation of something going on, like a feeling of a certain type, which would be a fairly simple type of computational step. But then you have one of them for each of the things that you're trying to measure, right? So that starts to get a bit imparsimonious, like the original due process theory.
Yeah. I mean, you're bringing your computational perspective to this, and I think it's important to think about what's being computed, and what the metacognitive components are doing in terms of, what are they monitoring in terms of output, and what is that leading to in terms of triggers. I mean, these are hard questions, Mark. They're good ones.
There was.
Sorry, yeah, got a left bias, so here I'm not.
She was first, I would say.
It doesn't matter because I finished building on his. We have a hypothesis for what is triggering the metacognitive reflective aspect in an individual. Do we have?
Well, I think this notion of feeling of rightness is very important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We want the feeling to be new,
And the evidence suggests it's very effective.
You want to identify what feeling means? Do you have that hypothesis?
I mean, it's notions of fluency are important, I think. It all comes down to that affective component of processing feels that it's fluent, that it's progressing well.
To the individual.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one thing that's very interesting is what happens in collaborative reasoning. I mean, is there such a thing as collaborative fluency? Some sense of fluency during reasoning.
That's in your mind.
Exactly.
More complex as opposed to one individual and their.
Yeah.
Okay.
And things get really interesting there when I'm thinking about whether you're having a fluent experience and whether
Yes.
I'm fluent, and it's conflict between us in terms of fluency and feelings of rights. So, cognition gets really complex and it's collaborative.
Valerie has worked much on that.
Yeah, can you help me?
So, Mark was right that we want to think about it. I think in the first one, right? That if responding to confuse, confuse such as familiarity. There'll be cues that are sort of task specific that are, particular to this. But these are the sorts of drivers that we postulates contribute to this feeling sense of rightness.
That's helpful, thank you. Oh, yeah, of course.
Question then, there is the end of the panel.
Yeah.
Discussions.
Well, this is actually not a question, it's more of an additional answer to what Mark was saying about or like another way to think about it is that I'll talk about cues, but I mean, you don't need to necessarily outline all the possible sources of conflicting intuitions. You just need to know that the proponent responses that are conflicting to know what's triggering the subsequent process. And so it's the same sort of model that you have for a group task. There's the system doesn't know what to do because there's conflicting things that are deciding go here, go there. And so you just get a mechanism that decides what's going to conflicting, what you can be more about this. And so there's a way to simplify all these sorts of things, but I mean, you might simplify it to oblivion, but yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you, good. Yeah, thanks.
We just have a last quick question from the chat that will between system 1 and system 2 thinking, which is more vulnerable to external influences like advertising, peer pressure, or emotional manipulation, and how can training impact each?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say system 1 is because it's highly contextualized. That's where there can be a lot of kind of emotional affective manipulation, which can be hard to overcome through training and intervention. Yeah, so I think it's we see a lot of this kind of system 1 processing. I think driving a lot of advertising effects, marketing effects, ideological, political effects. Yeah, although it's controversial. Yeah, system 1, type 1. So much. Thank you.